Marcus Thompson had always loved the sound of rushing water. Standing on his dam walkway that crisp October morning, coffee mug in hand, he watched the controlled spillway send crystal clear mountain water cascading down into the valley below. The lake behind him stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the autumn colors of the surrounding hills. This was his sanctuary. His grandfather had built this dam in 1952, and Marcus had inherited not just the property, but the responsibility that came with controlling the water supply for 3 counties. Downstream, what he didn't expect to see that morning was a convoy of construction trucks rumbling along the far shore of his lake. Marcus squinted through the morning mist, his coffee growing cold in his grip. Yellow bulldozers were already at work, clearing trees along the pristine shoreline that had remained untouched for decades. The sound of chainsaws echoed across the water, a violent symphony that made his chest tighten with something between confusion and rage. He grabbed his binoculars from the dam control house and focused on the activity. Men in hard hats were surveying the land, pointing at different sections of the shore as if they owned the place. Behind them, a woman in a crisp business suit stood with her arms crossed, gesturing emphatically at a set of blueprints. Marcus jumped into his boat and gunned the engine across the lake. As he approached the construction site, he could hear the woman's voice carrying across the water, sharp and authoritative. "I want the premium cabins facing due east," she was saying to a man who appeared to be the foreman. "Our residents deserve the best sunrise views, and make sure the boat slips are deep enough for yacht access." Marcus pulled his boat up to the makeshift dock the crew had already installed. The woman turned toward him, her expression shifting from annoyance to practiced politeness in a split second. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting he was the one out of place. "I'm Marcus Thompson. I own this lake." His voice was steady, but his hands were trembling slightly. "What exactly is going on here?" The woman's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Oh, you must be confused. I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association. We have full development rights to this shoreline." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. "Development rights? This is private property. My property." Karen pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. According to our survey and legal documentation, this entire shoreline falls within our community boundaries. We've already broken ground on 60 luxury cabins, and construction will be completed by spring." The foreman, a weathered man named Pete, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, maybe we should double-check those property lines again. This fella seems pretty sure about Pete." Karen's voice cut through his words like a blade. "We've been over this. The county approved our permits. The environmental impact study was filed. Everything is perfectly legal." She turned back to Marcus with that same plastic smile. "Now, I understand change can be difficult, but this development will bring jobs and economic growth to the area. I'm sure once you see the benefits. Marcus's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You're destroying a pristine ecosystem. This lake feeds 3 major rivers downstream. The wildlife corridor you're bulldozing has been protected for over 70 years. Karen's patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your environmental concerns, but progress requires sacrifice. These cabins will house some of the area's most influential residents. We're talking about senators, business leaders, people who can really make a difference for this community." Marcus looked around at the destruction already underway. Ancient oak trees lay fallen like broken bones, their root systems exposed and dying. The crystal clear water near the shore was already turning muddy from the construction runoff. "You can't do this," He said quietly, "I'm afraid we already are," Karen replied. Turning back to her blueprints, "Pete, I want those foundation holes dug by evening. We're behind schedule." Marcus stood there for a moment, watching his grandfather's legacy being torn apart by strangers who seemed to believe paperwork trumped decades of stewardship. The sound of chainsaws resumed, drowning out the natural symphony of the lake heat. Grown-up loving Dot as he walked back to his boat, Pete caught up with him. "Hey, buddy," the foreman said in a low voice, glancing back to make sure Karen wasn't listening. "Look, I got kids to feed, so I can't make waves, but something about this whole thing doesn't sit right with me. That lady showed up with permits that looked fresh off the printer, if you know what I mean." Marcus nodded grimly. "Thanks for the heads up." Driving his boat back across the lake, Marcus's mind was racing. He needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. But as he tied up at his dock and looked back at the construction site, he realized that even if he could prove Karen was lying, the damage was already being done. What would you have done, faced with watching your family's legacy destroyed by someone who claimed to have the law on their side? Marcus was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to protect what was his. The next morning, Marcus sat in the cramped office of Millfield County's planning department, surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. Betty Patterson, the county clerk who'd been there for 37 years, was pulling out dusty folders with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew where every document was hidden. "Well, I'll be damned," Betty muttered, adjusting her reading glasses. "Marcus, according to these records, the Lakeshore Estates HOA filed their development permits 6 months ago. But here's the strange part. The property lines they submitted don't match anything in our historical records." Marcus leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" Betty spread out a series of maps on her desk. "Your grandfather's original deed from 1950 clearly shows he owned the entire lake and a 1,000-foot buffer zone around the perimeter. But this new survey," she pointed to a more recent document, "shows the HOA claiming ownership of everything except a narrow strip where your house sits. That's impossible. My family has paid property taxes on that land for 70 years. I know. Honey, I processed most of those payments myself." Betty's weathered face creased with concern. "But somehow, Karen Whitfield got these permits approved by the county commissioner's office without any of us old-timers ever seeing them." Marcus felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. Who signed off on them? Commissioner Bradley. But Marcus, that's the weird part. Jerry Bradley has been in the hospital for the past 2 months recovering from hip surgery. He hasn't signed anything. Meanwhile, back at the lake, the construction had accelerated to a frantic pace. Marcus could see the work lights blazing even after sunset, the sounds of machinery echoing across the water well into the night. Karen had brought in a second crew, and they were working in shifts around the clock. Marcus decided to take another boat ride to assess the damage. What he found made his blood boil. Not only had they cleared more trees, but they had started dumping construction waste directly into the lake. Cement mix clouded the water, and diesel fuel created rainbow slicks near the shore. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The water that had run crystal clear for decades was now the color of chocolate milk. Dead fish were already floating belly up near the construction zone. "This is a disaster," he muttered to himself. "Yeah, it really is." Marcus spun around to find a young woman in hiking gear, standing on the shore. She had a camera with a telephoto lens slung around her neck and the determined look of someone who'd spent the morning documenting environmental destruction. "You're Thompson, right?" The guy who owns the dam. She extended her hand. I'm Sarah Chen, environmental reporter for the Valley Tribune. I've been covering this story since yesterday. Marcus shook her hand gratefully. Please tell me you're here to expose what's happening. That's the plan. But I have to tell you, Karen Whitfield has some serious connections. She's already called my editor twice, threatening lawsuits if we publish anything that makes the HOA look bad. They were interrupted by the sound of a boat engine. Karen was approaching in a gleaming white yacht, flanked by two men in expensive suits. Mr. Thompson, Karen called out cheerfully as she pulled up to the construction dock. I'm so glad you're here. I'd like you to meet someone. She stepped onto the dock with the confidence of someone who owned the place, followed by her companions. This is Richard Blackstone from Blackstone Development and his partner, District Attorney Mitchell Hayes. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The DA was involved in this. Hayes stepped forward with a politician's smile. Mr. Thompson, I understand you have some concerns about this development. I want to assure you that everything here is completely above board. We've dotted every I and crossed every T. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, these permits are fraudulent. Commissioner Bradley never signed them. He's been in the hospital. Hayes' smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Thompson. I hope you have solid evidence to support such claims, because making false statements about legal documents can have serious consequences. The threat was clear, but Marcus wasn't backing down. I have Betty Patterson pulling the original property records right now. When those come to light, oh, you mean these records? Karen produced another folder from her briefcase. I'm afraid poor Betty made a mistake. The historical documents she showed you were misfiled. These are the correct property deeds, properly notarized and filed with the state. Sarah had been quietly recording the entire conversation. On her phone, Ms. Whitfield, can you explain how your organization acquired development rights to land that's been in the Thompson family for 70 years? Karen's smile turned predatory. Simple eminent domain proceedings. The state determined that this land would serve the greater public good as a residential development, rather than sitting unused as a private lake. Marcus's world was crashing. Down around him, these people had somehow managed to forge documents, bribe officials, and manipulate the legal system to steal his family's land. You can't do this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Actually, we can, Hayes replied. That we are, Mr. Thompson. I strongly suggest you accept the compensation offer we're prepared to make for your remaining property. This development is happening whether you cooperate or not. As the three conspirators climbed back into their yacht, Sarah put her hand on Marcus's shoulder. I'm going to fight this story. Well, it's going to take time. They've got the legal system locked up tight. Marcus watched the yacht disappear around the bend, then looked back at his grandfather's dam. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These people thought they could steal his heritage and destroy a pristine ecosystem because they had money and connections. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed Marcus would fight them in their rigged courtrooms and corrupt bureaucracies. They had no idea he controlled something far more powerful than any legal document. He controlled the water itself. As Sarah packed up her camera equipment, she noticed Marcus staring at the dam controls with an expression she couldn't quite read. Marcus, you okay? He turned to her with a strange, calm smile. Sarah, how quickly can flood conditions change downstream? What do you mean? But Marcus was already walking toward the dam control house, his mind working through calculations his grandfather had taught him decades ago. If Karen Whitfield wanted to play dirty, She was about to learn that some games had consequences she never saw coming. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's confrontation with Karen and her cronies. The construction had progressed at an alarming rate. 18 cabins were already completed, their fresh cedar walls gleaming in the morning sun. The HOA had even installed a fancy sign at the entrance, Lakeshore Estates, luxury living at nature's edge. Marcus had spent those weeks in what appeared to be defeated acceptance. He met with lawyers who told him the legal battle could take years and cost more than his property was worth. He'd watch helplessly as Karen's crews dumped more construction waste into his pristine lake, turning sections of it into an industrial disaster zone. But appearances could be deceiving. What nobody knew was that Marcus had been conducting his own research. He discovered that Karen Whitfield wasn't just an HOA president. She was the front person for a massive development scheme involving several state politicians and a construction company with ties to organized crime. The luxury cabins were just phase one. Phase two involved turning the entire lake into a private resort for wealthy clients who needed somewhere discreet to conduct their business. More importantly, Marcus had been studying weather patterns and water tables. A massive storm system was approaching from the west, expected to dump 6 inches of rain over the next 48 hours. Under normal circumstances, his dam was designed to handle that kind of rainfall easily. But these weren't normal circumstances. On the morning the storm hit, Marcus stood in his dam control house, watching the rain begin to fall in earnest. His hands hovered over the controls his grandfather had taught him to operate as a teenager. The massive steel gates that regulated water flow downstream were designed to prevent flooding. During heavy rains, Marcus had spent the night welding them. Sarah Chen arrived at his house just as the rain was reaching its peak intensity. She'd been investigating the story for weeks, and something about Marcus's calm demeanor over the past few days had made her nervous. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she asked, finding him standing calmly on his porch, watching the lake level rise. "Waiting," he replied simply. "Waiting for what?" Before Marcus could answer, Sarah's phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. Flash flood warning for Millfield County. Residents in low-lying areas should evacuate immediately. Sarah looked out at the lake, then back at Marcus, realization dawning on her face. "Marcus, you didn't." "The dam gates malfunction sometimes during heavy storms," Marcus said quietly. "It's an old system. Sometimes they get stuck." Across the lake, chaos was erupting at the construction site. Pete, the foreman, was frantically trying to get his crew to higher ground as water began pouring over the partially completed retaining walls. The 18 finished cabins, built at the lake's normal water level, were suddenly sitting in what was rapidly becoming a flood zone. Karen Whitfield arrived on the scene in her white SUV, her usual composure cracking as she watched muddy water begin seeping under the doors of her luxury cabins. "What the hell is happening?" she screamed at Pete. "Ma'am, the lake level's rising fast. We need to evacuate the site before." "No, we have $18 million invested in these structures. You figure out how to stop this water." But there was no stopping it. The storm was dumping water into the lake faster than the natural spillways could handle it. And with the main gate sealed shut, the lake had nowhere to go but up and out by noon. The water had risen 8 feet above normal levels. The beautiful wooden docks Karen had installed were completely submerged. The luxury cabin's ground floors were flooded, their carefully installed hardwood floors buckling and warping in the muddy water. Marcus watched from his elevated position, feeling a grim satisfaction as nature began reclaiming what had been taken from it. The ancient oak trees that had been bulldozed were getting their revenge, their root systems, disturbed by construction, were failing under the waterlogged soil, causing mudslides that took out 3 more cabins. But then Sarah grabbed his arm, her face pale with shock. "Marcus, look at the news." She held up her phone, showing a breaking news report. The headline made Marcus's blood run cold. "Dam failure threatens elementary school to 200 children evacuated." The reporter continued, "The rising water from Thompson Dam has overwhelmed the Mill Creek Elementary School 3 miles downstream. The building's basement is completely flooded, and children are being evacuated to higher ground as a precaution." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him in his focus on punishing Karen and her corrupt associates. He'd forgotten about the school. Mill Creek Elementary sat in a low-lying area that had been built assuming the dam would always regulate water flow properly. "Oh God," he whispered, "I didn't think about the school." Sarah stared at him in horror. "Marcus, there are children down there. You have to open those gates." But as Marcus ran toward the dam control house, he discovered something that made his heart stop. The gates weren't just welded shut. The control mechanism had been sabotaged. Someone had poured concrete into the hydraulic systems. While he'd been distracted by the rising water, he spun around to find Karen Whitfield standing behind him. No longer the polished businesswoman, but a desperate criminal whose multi-million-dollar scheme was literally underwater. "You destroyed everything," she snarled, holding a pistol with shaking hands. 40 years I've been planning this development. 40 years of building connections, greasing palms, setting up the perfect crime. Karen, there are children in danger downstream. We have to know." She screamed. "You caused this. You're going to figure out how to fix it, or those kids' blood is on your hands." Marcus realized with growing horror that Karen had played him perfectly. She'd known he would try to flood the construction site, and she'd used his own plan against him. Now she had him trapped. If he couldn't restore normal water flow, children would die, and it would be his fault. But there was one thing Karen didn't know about the dam's design. One secret his grandfather had built into the system that Marcus had never shared with anyone. As sirens wailed in the distance and rescue helicopters circled overhead, Marcus looked at the woman who'd stolen his land and realized that sometimes the only way to win a rigged game was to change the rules entirely. "Karen," he said quietly, "you made one mistake." "What's that?" Marcus smiled grimly as he reached for a hidden panel his grandfather had installed 70 years ago. "You assumed I only had one way to control the water." The hidden panel Marcus opened revealed a manual override system that his grandfather had installed as a failsafe during the dam's original construction in 1952. It was a purely mechanical system, designed to work even if the main hydraulic controls were destroyed. Marcus's hand shook as he turned the heavy wheel, feeling the massive backup gates slowly grinding open deep beneath the dam structure. The relief was immediate. Water began flowing downstream at a controlled rate, dropping the lake level just fast enough to save the elementary school without causing a catastrophic flood. Within minutes, Marcus could hear the evacuation sirens in the distance changing from urgent alerts to all clear signals. Karen stood frozen, her gun still pointed at Marcus, but her expression shifting from rage to dawning comprehension. "You planned this," she whispered. "All of it." Marcus shook his head. "I planned to flood your illegal construction site. I never wanted to hurt those kids. But you sabotaged the main controls. You were willing to let children die to frame me for your crimes." Sarah, who had been documenting everything on her phone, stepped forward. "Karen, You might want to know that I've been recording this entire conversation, including the part where you admitted to 40 years of corruption and bribery. It was then that Karen made her final desperate play. Instead of surrendering, she raised the gun toward Sarah. "Give me that phone." Nobody's going to believe any of this without proof. But Karen had forgotten about Pete, the construction foreman, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the whole operation. He tackled her from behind, sending the gun spinning across the wet concrete. Within moments, the arriving police had Karen in handcuffs. As the immediate crisis passed, the true scope of Karen's crimes began to unravel. The environmental reporter, Sarah, had been working with federal investigators for weeks. The fraudulent permits, the bribed officials, the stolen land. It was all part of a much larger corruption network that stretched across 3 states. District Attorney Hayes was arrested at his office. That afternoon, Commissioner Bradley, recovering in the hospital, was cleared of all wrongdoing when investigators discovered that someone had been forging his signature for months. Richard Blackstone and his development company were exposed as a front for money laundering operations that had been stealing protected land across the region. But the real victory came 3 days later, as Marcus stood on his dam walkway watching. The lake returned to its natural level. The water was running clear again, the construction waste settling harmlessly into sediment that would be filtered out over time. Nature was already beginning to heal itself. 18 luxury cabins sat ruined along the shoreline, their foundations cracked, their interiors destroyed by flood damage. But rather than an eyesore, they'd become something unexpected. Artificial reefs that were already attracting fish and providing nesting sites for water birds. Pete approached Marcus as he surveyed the scene. The foreman had been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing and had agreed to help with the cleanup. "You know," Pete said, "I've been in construction for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened to those cabins. It's like the lake just took them back." Marcus nodded. "My grandfather always said this lake has a long memory. It doesn't forget when it's been disrespected." Sarah joined them, her camera capturing the strange beauty of the partially submerged structures. "Marcus, I've been thinking about this whole situation. What Karen did was obviously criminal, but what you did, flooding the construction site, trapping her in her own scheme, that took incredible calculation." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "When I realized what they'd done, forging documents, bribing officials, destroying 70 years of environmental protection, I knew the legal system wasn't going to help. They'd rigged the game too well. So you changed the rules. I let nature enforce its own laws." The final revelation came when investigators discovered that Karen's entire development scheme had been funded by money laundered through offshore accounts. The 60 cabins she planned to build would have housed some of the country's most wanted white-collar criminals, creating a criminal haven disguised as a luxury resort. Marcus's actions hadn't just protected his family's land, they'd inadvertently prevented the creation of a criminal sanctuary. 6 months later, Marcus stood on his dam walkway once again, but this time he wasn't alone. The state had designated his lake as a protected watershed, ensuring it would remain pristine for future generations. Sarah's reporting had won her a Pulitzer Prize and led to the largest corruption investigation in the state's history. Pete had started his own construction company, specializing in environmental restoration. His first contract was removing the damaged cabins and restoring the lake's shoreline to its natural state. The 18 ruined structures were carefully dismantled, their materials recycled into a beautiful visitor center that would educate people about the importance of watershed protection. The foundation ruins became artificial reefs, teeming with fish and aquatic life. As Marcus watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, he thought about the lesson his grandfather had taught him decades ago. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Let the water find its own level, and it will show you the truth. Karen Whitfield was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for fraud, corruption, and environmental crimes. District Attorney Hayes received 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. The investigation ultimately led to the arrest of 37 officials across 3 states, dismantling one of the largest land theft operations in American history. But perhaps the most satisfying justice was the simplest. The lake rang clear again. The wildlife returned, and the ancient rhythms of nature resumed their eternal cycle. Marcus still controlled the dam, but now he understood something his grandfather had known all along. He wasn't the master of the water. He was its guardian. And sometimes, being a guardian meant knowing when to step back and let nature take its course. What would you have done, faced with such a choice between legal justice and natural consequences? Marcus had learned that sometimes the most profound victories come not from fighting the current, but from understanding which way the water wants to flow. The lake remembered everything, and it had a long memory for justice. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of, or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Confessional Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.